everyone. So today we're going to be beginning our videos studying short stories. Why are we doing that in English 100, you might be asking? Well, the reason is that this course is exploring how language is used differently in different genres. And the genre here clearly is going to be literary. That does not mean that we forget everything that we've been learning about rhetoric. In fact, in some instances, a work of literature can be very rhetorical in the sense that we've been talking about. For example, think about the novel All Quiet on the Western Front, a very famous post-First World War novel written by Erich Remarque. This has a very clear message. It's an anti-war message. And the ethos in that novel is the very fact that Remarque himself was in the trenches. He knew what he was talking about. And the main rhetorical strategy, pathos. It's designed to upset us, to make us very concerned and worried and desperate that this should not happen again. It's an anti-war message. So yes, of course, there are instances where literature involves all the rhetorical strategies and devices that we've been discussing. But more generally, more commonly, I think it's fair to say that the message is more nuanced, more subtle, more open to interpretation. And rather it's a case that a work of literature is encouraging us to think anew or afresh about our lives, our relationships, and the world around us. That's its function in life, in our lives. And so it is with the short story we will be looking at in this video called The Bloody Chamber by Angela Carter. I'll just bring it up on the screen now. I've already, of course, sent this to you by email, and it's on eLearn too. And I'm assuming that you have read this story. If you haven't, and you're listening to me right now, then stop listening to me and read the bloody story, right? Because otherwise what I say subsequently isn't going to make a lot of sense. Don't be freaked out by the fact that this is, 30 pages long. The other short stories we'll be examining will be much, much shorter. But there are all sorts of reasons why I want us to begin with this. There's so much going on. And I think it's brilliant, actually, the way that it's put together. You can see it's written by Angela Carter back in the 1970s. It's actually part of a collection of short stories, but the collection is named after this first story, The Bloody Chamber. You know, when we set out to do something, an analysis, I think it helps to have structure, so that we have a kind of clear idea of how we're going to approach the task ahead of us. What I've always done and what I teach my students, whether it be in English 100 or in my literature classes, when we're approaching a work of literature, it's to ask ourselves certain questions. In fact, they're familiar to you. I mean, the first question we should ask ourselves is what is the message? And if there isn't a clear message, then what are the themes? The second question we should ask ourselves is, how does the language, the structure, communicate the themes? We're familiar with that, right? And then we will add in other questions pertinent to our study of literature and the particular subgenre we're dealing with here, a short story or a novel, or it could be a film script. We will start asking about characterization. How does the characterization, the journeys taken by the characters, develop or communicate the theme? How does the plot do that? How does the setting do that? The point of view. These are the questions we would start looking at so as to sort of broaden our analysis and make it more substantive. If we were approaching a drama, there are extra questions that we might feed in here to do with stagecraft, all right, to do with dramatic irony. And similarly with a film. I mean, no doubt there would be other sort of technical questions that we would be asking about screenplay development and so on. But the broader questions are still there, I think. So let's now do that. We've got this story, we've read it, it's called The Bloody Chamber. We should come up with some themes. What do we think this story is about? What is it asking us to reconsider? As we did previously in the course, it's not a bad idea to sort of begin with very sort of general, abstract nouns, and then sort of get more and more specific when we're trying to set out what the theme is. And in terms of sort of general thematic ideas here, we might have something like the loss of innocence. We might have something about the cruelty of men. We might have something about sadism, what it's like to be a woman. It could be that we think this is about sex. It could be about relationships. It could be about marriage, which is a pretty scary thought, isn't it? So, I mean, we will sketch down some basic kind of ideas of what we think the theme is, or the themes are. And then in the course of our subsequent analysis, the chances are we're going to, develop that. And so our sort of final understanding of the story will present us with a more substantive sort of thematic understanding of it. One of the ways we can do that, which is to say one of the ways we can build on our initial understanding of theme, is to look at the title. The title very often helps us to reveal more about the text. We've got a very suggestive title here, don't you think? The Bloody Chamber. And of course, you've read the story now, so you're immediately thinking, well, torture chamber. Yeah, okay, fine. But what else is a chamber? A chamber is another word for a bedroom. So that, if you like, transposes or transports the idea of a torture room into a bedroom, which is intrinsically disturbing, isn't it? That transition or transposition. And now we can just run with the ball a bit and go back to this title, The Bloody Chamber. What else might a chamber be? What is a chamber? It's kind of a receptacle, isn't it? A cavity. What might be a cavity filled with blood? And since we've arrived at the bedroom, and this is about a woman, presumably we're going to start thinking about womb or uterus, the menstrual cycle. And now we have a rather interesting, perhaps disturbing conflation of something which is designed to be reproductive and life-affirming with pain and suffering. All of that from the title. The other thing to do when you're trying to sort of develop your initial thoughts about theme is research. And when we read this story, probably we're already thinking about some fairy tale that we know about deep down. But in fact, we're invited to do so. There's a reference to the fairy tale of Bluebeard towards the end of this story. So that's what we ought to be researching and Googling. What was Bluebeard all about? What is the story of Bluebeard? And what we find is that it comes from, well, we think we can trace it back to Charles Perrault, French, who wrote the story of Bluebeard in 1697, and who seems to have drawn himself on an alleged, maybe apocryphal event of 150 years or so before. There was an aristocrat called Gilles de Rais who lived in Brittany, and of course this story is set in Brittany, northern France. who it seems disposed of several wives and was a notorious sadist. I mean, we don't know if that's the provenance of this exactly, but anyway, it appears that it very well might be. And subsequent to the Bluebeard story by Perrault, there are different versions in the different cultures of the Western Hemisphere. In England, it's a Mr. Fox, and who leads his brides into the forest, telling them to be bold but not too bold. And in fact, what's interesting here is when you kind of look at the common denominators of these different versions or iterations of the Bluebeard story, you have a kind of consistent message, and the message is to women not to be too curious. In other words, know your place, and this is what will happen to you if you are too bold or too curious. And so we see it's a very patriarchal text or narrative or story that runs through the ages, trying to sort of establish fixed relationships, to keep a woman in her place. So there we are. That actually helps to develop our understanding of this story, and it certainly raises two questions, or it should do. Question number one is, why does Angela Carter sit down and rewrite the Bluebeard story? And question number two is, what does she make different? The first question, why? Why do it? Why rewrite? I think is probably fairly easy to answer. I mean, anybody who writes does so because they believe in fiction. But specifically what they believe in is the power of fiction. The Latin root of fiction is fictio, and it means to shape, to fashion. That's what stories do. They profoundly affect us and fashion, or help to fashion, our self-identity and our relationship with the world around us and the people around us. Just think about yourself. Think about your background, your childhood, and its stories. Beginning with fairy tales, and then you've got, I don't know, Pokemon and Bakugan, and you've got Lord of the Rings, you've got Harry Potter. What's the stuff you've been reading, right? Well, it has helped to fashion your worldview. And it's tremendously powerful for that very reason. And so I think that's why she's doing it. She sees this as almost social activism to write in this sense. All right, well then, what does she do with the story? What's different? And I think there are two, I mean, there's more than that, but there are two things that come to mind right now. Firstly, we have the mother figure. Strong, ultimately redeeming, and very much a sort of frame at the beginning and at the end of the narrative. So that kind of sense of maternal, a celebration of maternal intuition and fortitude is I think an important element that helps us to distinguish this story from previous ones. The other difference is the extent to which arguably the bride here is culpable, but deliberately so. And this plays with the notion of victim and of what it is to be a victim. It's something that I want to come to a bit later when we turn to the bride herself. But it is that complicating element in this text which makes it arguably more interesting, more subtle, more nuanced, more powerful than previous very obvious fairy tales. Okay. Let's let's move on from theme and go to one of the other questions that we should be asking ourselves when we study literature. And it goes to characterization. How do the journeys taken by the different characters in the story, develop the theme or suggest the theme? And the first character I want to look at is the Marquis. How would you describe him now that you've read the story? Do you have a man in mind? I mean, that's pretty scary, isn't it, that thought? Certainly we're given a lot of description. My God, there's no end of description in this story. So one of the reasons I'm doing it, and I'll talk more about that in a moment or a bit later. But when it comes to the Marquis, we have somebody who is clearly as rich as Croesus. I mean, he's extraordinarily wealthy. He's an aristocrat. He's elderly. He's described as having, a grey streak in his hair. He's charming, but in a kind of sinister way. And he's extremely powerful. And there's something seductive about him, at least in the eyes of the bride. I think it will help to understand the way that he's described here. Page 8. So she's on the train with him, but there's this kind of door between them. And halfway down page 8, above the syncopated roar of the train, I could hear his even, steady breathing. Only the communicating door kept me from my husband, and it stood open. And if I rose up on my elbow, I could see the dark, leonine shape of his head. It's almost lion-like, with a mane. And my nostrils caught a whiff of the opulent male scent of leather and spices that always accompanied him, and sometimes during his courtship had been the only hint he gave me that he'd come into my mother's sitting room, for though he was a big man, he moved as softly as if all his shoes had soles of velvet. This idea of velvet paws, of a huge cat, who has that kind of scent about him. Wonderfully impressive and attractive and seriously bloody threatening. So there's also, of course, a suggestion of predator here. Just in that simple description, but down here at the bottom here, he was older than I. We find out that she was 17 across the page. So he's quite a bit older, and much older, and there were streaks of pure silver in his dark mane. But his strange, heavy, almost waxen face was not lined by experience. Rather, experience seemed to have washed it perfectly smooth, like a stone on a beach whose fissures have been eroded by successive tides. So it's almost a timeless face. And sometimes that face in stillness, when he listened to me playing, with the heavy eyelids folded over eyes that always disturbed me by their absolute absence of light, seemed to me like a mask. As if his real face, the face that truly reflected all the life he'd led in the world before he met me, before even I was born, as though that face lay underneath this mask or elsewhere. As though he had laid by the face in which he had lived for so long in order to offer my youth a face unsigned by the years. This idea of a mask, of something on the surface and then underneath, especially bearing in mind what this story is about, is suggesting to me a distinction that Nietzsche makes in his book called The Birth of Tragedy, between the Dionysian and the Apollonian in human nature. These are references to ancient Greek gods. The Dionysian takes us to that bestial, animal, elemental, unruly passion that we have inside us. And the Apollonian is that rational, reasonable, scientific, logical persona that we have. Nietzsche's point being that we need a bit of both, we need a balance. And then he feeds that into his discussion of tragedy. And you can see, on a tangent, you can see how this feeds into Freud, right? This idea that we have these unruly passions inside us, the pleasure principle, the id, which must be repressed for us to be healthy subjects. And it is the ego which helps to do that, with the superego giving us that notion of law and rules and so on. I'm just mentioning that literally because it's just come to me, because I think that that's kind of what she's getting at here, Carter, in writing the story, that there are these unruly dark passions inside us which we need to keep in check if we can, and look what happens if we don't. And so just the description of the Marquis is suggestive of that. And now I'm also wondering whether you could do a flip with the bride, so that at the end, the Dionysian in her comes to the surface and is that mark of shame on her forehead that she cannot remove. Anyway, we have a description of the Marquis. What does he do? What does he do to the bride? Answer, simply, he objectifies her. That is, if you like, his modus operandi. That is the mode in which he is ultimately going to abuse her, disabuse her, and get rid of her. It's an objectification process, a reduction down. And he objectifies her in many different ways. The first thing we can say, it's as though he considers her something that can be bought, purchased. Let's look at page 7, since we're here. And you can see the kind of flood of gifts that she's regaled with. So here we are, sort of halfway down page 7. There's the gigantic box with the wedding dress inside it, wrapped up in tissue paper and red ribbon, like a Christmas gift. There was a dress for the mother too. Towards the bottom of 8, he'd love to surprise me in my abstracted solitude at the piano. He would sort of soundlessly come in like the creeping cat. And guess what? He's got gifts. All right, so there's a bouquet of flowers or a box of marron glacé chocolates or whatever. Across the page, halfway down 9, he had the ring ready in a leather box lined with crimson velvet. So it's something inside something else, okay, to be revealed. Crimson, of course, velvet, a fire opal the size of a pigeon's egg, set in a complicated circle of dark antique gold. We have the important choker, page 11, third of the way down. Here's the wedding gift, right? Clasped around my throat, a choker of rubies 2 inches wide, like an extraordinarily precious slit throat. I mean, the foreshadowing is so obvious as to be sort of Baroque. We'll get to that later. And here we are, the flashing crimson jewels round her throat, bright as arterial blood. '18. Yeah, look at what he says here. They're very self-knowing, these characters. 18 at the bottom, you know, she's upset about the fact that it's the honeymoon and he's immediately going to go traveling somewhere. And he said, unspoken to my wounded vanity, I've had too many honeymoons to find them in the least pressing commitments. I know quite well that this child I've bought with a handful of coloured stones and the pelts of dead beasts won't run away. I've got you, I've purchased you, you're mine. Page 15, halfway down, my purchaser unwrapped his bargain. So it's a very clear sense in which we have objectification in the way of purchase here. We also have it, and it's exactly referred to here on page 15, objectification in the form of consumption. She is something to be eaten, to be taken in and consumed. He stripped me, Gorman that he was, as if he was stripping the leaves off an artichoke. And do not imagine much finesse about it. That artichoke was no particular treat for the diner, nor was he yet in any greedy haste. That comes later. But here we are. The child with her stick-like limbs, naked but for her button boots, her gloves shielding her face with her hand, and the old monocled lecturer who examined her limb by limb. This is the reference to the pornography. He, in his London tailoring, she bare as a lamb chop. And so we have this, again, this metaphoric, figurative way in which female body is now something to be eaten and consumed. And this is developed later, right at the end. I think we should go there, right at the end, 39. And look at the imagery that he uses here when he's summoning her to the execution block. Don't loiter, girl, top of 39. Do you think I shall lose appetite for the meal? If you are so long about serving it, I shall grow hungrier, more ravenous with each moment, more cruel. I have a place prepared for your exquisite corpse in my display of flesh. Of course, the most common and obvious way in which objectification happens is through the gaze, it's through the eyes. And there are many instances here where she is object, almost objet d'art, or a pornographic sort of image for him to lech over, to view and to gaze. I think, go back to 11, we've got this. Halfway down, I saw him watching me in the gilded mirrors with the assessing eye of a connoisseur inspecting horseflesh, or even of a housewife in the market inspecting cuts on the slab. So we have this conflation now of viewing and viewing as piece of flesh. And then on 14, I mean, holy crap. I mean, look at these mirrors everywhere. Towards the bottom of 14, there's the bed, and surrounded by so many mirrors. Mirrors on all the walls, in stately frames of contorted gold. Not just gold, but contorted, which suggests stretched and in an agonized way. That reflected more white lilies than I'd ever seen in my life before. Why lilies? These are pungent. I actually don't like the smell of lilies at all. They're just, yeah. Some people love it, but you can't avoid it. I mean, they're pungent. I think they're associated with funerals. And indeed, earlier on in the description of the Marquis, his face is described as lily-like, as having that kind of fleshy, petally kind of composition to it. He'd filled the room with mirrors to greet the bride, the young bride, who'd become that multitude of girls I saw in the mirrors, identical in their chic navy blue tailor-mades. See, he said, gesturing towards these elegant girls, I've acquired a whole harem for myself. I found that I was trembling. My breath came thickly. I could not meet his eye and turned my head away out of pride, out of shyness, and watched a dozen husbands approach me in a dozen mirrors. And so, we have the multiplication, the myriad gaze, as if to, this is typical Carter. This is the way she's writing it. She doesn't just say something. She will find multiple ways of saying it, or multiple images to sort of amplify what she's doing here. And ultimately, the objectification is that the bride is something to be taken in a very animal way, in the sex act. And this is where we're headed now. Here we have the lilies again at the bottom of 15 with the heavy pollen and the powders in your fingers that you come. And they stain you. So we have the lead up to the actual consummation of this marriage at the bottom of 17. He takes her, and in the mirrors, a dozen husbands impaled a dozen brides, while the mewing girls swung on invisible trapezes in the empty air outside. It's just fabulous imagery. This image, circus-like almost on the trapezes, but an animal primal scream projected onto the lover's bed, if we can even refer to it in that way. It is a brutal act. Look at how she describes it. I was brought to my senses by the insistent shrilling of the telephone. So if you like, the mewing of the girls, the shrill there sort of transposes, merges into the shrilling noise of the telephone inside. He lay beside me, felled like an oak, breathing stertorously, as if he had been fighting with me. In the course of that one-sided struggle, I'd seen his deathly composure shatter like a porcelain vase flung against the wall. The mask, the Apollonian mask, is just shattered, and look what's underneath. It's the animal, the shriek, the blaspheming at the orgasm, and the blood. And perhaps I'd seen his face without its mask, and perhaps I had not. After all, which is the mask? Yet I had been infinitely dishevelled by the loss of my virginity, and there's this sense of a transitory moment, something that's a dialectic. It can never be recovered. It's happened. It's gone. It's past, and it's brutal in the way that she has experienced it. Pretty disturbing, sinister figure, this guy, isn't he? Is there any invitation in the story for us to feel sympathy for him? And how could we even imagine feeling sympathy for him? I think Carter takes us a little bit down that track. If we go to page 35, there's a recognition in the bride that the Marquis is damaged, in despair, somehow self-aware of the monster that he is. Halfway down, it seemed to me he was in despair. I felt there emanate from him at that moment a stench of absolute despair. The stench, the smell here, noisome. It's part of the symbolism of this text, isn't it? From the lilies to his attractive sense in the beginning of the story to now this almost decay, putrid. So there it is. It's rank and ghastly, as if the lilies that surrounded him had all at once begun to fester, or the Russian leather of his scent were reverting to the elements of flayed hide and excrement of which it was composed. I mean, look, Dionysian Apollonian. What's underneath? The catonic gravity of his presence exerted a tremendous pressure on the room, so that the blood pounded in my ears, as if we'd been precipitated to the bottom of the sea beneath the waves that pounded against the shore. I could expect no mercy. Yet when he raised his head and stared at me with his blind, shuttered eyes, as though he did not recognize me, I felt a terrified pity for him, for this man who lived in such strange secret places. The atrocious loneliness of that monster. So I think that's perhaps the way in which Carter is suggesting an empathy or sympathy. It's almost as though he's fated, and so we have this idea of how you cannot resist your fate. It's almost suggesting a kind of Mary Shelley Frankenstein dimension to this. He's an animal and can't stop being the animal that he is. Whether sympathy is the right word here or not, I don't know, but at least Carter is encouraging us to think about him perhaps in that way. Well, that's for you to conjecture and decide for yourself. If we turn to the bride, and again, we're asking that question, how does character, and I suppose character and plot develop the theme? The one thing we should begin by saying, and I want to do so in case I forget, is that she doesn't have a name. I'm sure you noticed that. If you didn't, you should have. And nor does he. It's the Marquis, the bride, the mother. Why is that? Why don't these characters have names? So when that happens, I think the writer is encouraging us to generalize, to see these as representative, symbolic characters. He is all Marquis. She is all brides. The mother is all mothers. So it's that every man, every woman characterization I think we've got here. There's one exception though, isn't there? Which character has a name? Answer, the piano tuner. What is the name? Jean-Yves. Why does he have a name and why is it Jean-Yves? Come to that in a second. But let's just focus now a bit on the bride. How do you describe it, having read the story? Young, 17, very impressionable, easily impressed, it seems, easily overawed, materialistic, and if he objectifies her partly by buying her, then I think it's fair to say she's easily bought, isn't she? And stubborn, or maybe not stubborn, but willful. I mean, look at the bottom of page 7 here. Are you sure you love him? Asks the mother. I'm sure I want to marry him, I said, and would say no more. And she sighed as if it was with reluctance. So yeah, I mean, she's easily impressed and kind of drawn into this man's seductive power. Um, page 12, I think, may help us too. So she's describing this man, top of page 12, and then she says, I could not say I felt one single twinge of regret for the world of tartine and maman that now receded from me as if drawn away on a string, like a child's toy as the train began to throb again, as if in delighted anticipation of the distance it would take me. And she's excited. I mean, and he wouldn't be, but she's fallen for it. What's the main problem with the bride? What's the question we might find ourselves asking about her? There's the question of why does she marry him? Well, I think we've partly sort of gone down the track with that. Then there's the question of why doesn't she run? Why doesn't she get away? Particularly after she's seen the pornography, which is on page 16. Particularly after the brutality of the sex act, the way that he just, disappears on their honeymoon, and particularly after the bloody, bloody chamber. Well, there is one simple answer to that question, which is that she wants to or thinks about escaping and she can't. She's trapped. I mean, why don't we at least go there? So that's 28. 28, she's sort of arrived in the chamber, the place she's been told not to go to. And so one of the reasons she doesn't escape is because she's brave, she's courageous, and she's curious. Absolute darkness, and about me the instruments of mutilation. Until that moment, this spoiled child did not know she had inherited nerves and a will from the mother who had defied the yellow apples of Indochina. My mother's spirit drove me on into that dreadful place. I'd be scarpering, right? Maybe you would too. She's lighting more matches. She wants to see what's here. What's under this? What's inside the Iron Maiden? Okay, so she sees this horrific stuff, and then she thinks to herself, you know what? It might be a really good idea to get out of this if I can. And now we have the extent to which she feels trapped or is trapped. I could not take refuge in my bedroom because that retained the memory of his presence. This is page 30 at the top here. The music room was the safe place. My mind was in a tumult. Schemes for flight jostled with one another. As soon as the tide receded from the causeway, I would make for the mainland. So she's thinking, okay, I'm going to escape here. On foot, running, stumbling. I did not trust the leather-clad chauffeur, nor the well-behaved housekeeper. And I dared not take any of the pale, ghostly maids into my confidence either, since they were his creatures. Once at the village, I would fling myself directly on the mercy of the gendarmerie. But could I trust them either? His forefathers had ruled this coast for 8 centuries from this castle. What about the police, the judges, the judge? They could all be in his service. Who, on this distant coast, would believe the white-faced girl from Paris, who came running to them with a shuddering tale of blood, of fear, of the ogre murmuring in the shadows? Or they would immediately know it to be true, but were honour bound to let me carry it no further. And then, course, it turns out that the telephone is dead. So she can't escape. She's trapped in that sense, although she doesn't actually test it. But there's something else. There's something else here which Carter deliberately puts in front of us. There's another reason why she doesn't escape. There's another reason why she goes along with all of this. Let's go to page 20. Halfway down, we have a log in the fire, sparks, green flame. She feels giddy. I was afraid, not so much of him, of his monstrous presence. No, I was not afraid of him, but of myself. I seemed reborn in his unreflective eyes, reborn in unfamiliar shapes. I hardly recognized myself from his descriptions of me, and yet, might there not be a grain of beastly truth in them? And in the red firelight I blushed again, unnoticed, to think he might have chosen me because, in my innocence, he sensed a rare talent for corruption. "15. He strips her. There she is in the mirror, halfway down. Most pornographic of all confrontations. And so my purchaser unwrapped his bargain. And, as at the opera, when I'd first seen my flesh in his eyes, I was aghast to feel myself stirring." Page 22. She's drowsing, tossing and turning. There's the perfume of the lilies. She feels a vague desolation that within me now my female wound had healed. There had awoken a certain queasy craving, like the cravings of pregnant women. Had he not hinted to me in his flesh, as in his speech and looks, of the thousand baroque intersections of flesh upon flesh, I lay in our wide bed accompanied by a sleepless companion, my dark newborn curiosity. And finally on this 33, so she's talking with Jean-Yves, the piano tuner here, and she tells him of this terrible thing that's in this castle, and this monster that the Marquis is. Oh God, he said, I can smell the blood. And he says to, the bottom of 32, we whisper all manner of strange tales up and down the coast. He said, there was a Marquis once. He used to hunt young girls on the mainland. He hunted them with dogs, as though they were foxes. Well, maybe this is Gilles de Rais, back in the day. Oh, madame, I thought all these were old wives' tales. How could you know? How could I know indeed? Says the bride, except that in my heart I'd always known its lord would be the death of me. So it's as though she's intuitive right from the start. What's going to happen here? And even when she could have stopped it, could have escaped, could have simply said no to the marriage, she's gone along with it. As though there's a sense of destiny taking her there. At the bottom of 37, we have a very interesting moment between the piano tuner and the bride. "You do not deserve this," he said. And look at what she says in reply. She says, "Who can say what I deserve or know? I've done nothing, but that may be sufficient reason for condemning me." "Well, you disobeyed him," he said. "That is sufficient reason for him to punish you." "I only did what he knew I would." Now, that little kind of moment suggests a very famous character, historical character, biblical character, a character who's just about to be named on the next page. And who is it? I hope that you're saying Eve, as in Adam and Eve. Here we are, like Eve, he said. What's going on here? Carter's brilliant. She's a brilliant writer, right? She's not dropping this stuff without doing it deliberately. So let's examine the problem. The theological problem wrestled with over millennia, presented by the story of Adam and Eve in Genesis in the Bible, is that Eve is held to be guilty or culpable. She's told not to take anything from the tree of knowledge, the apple, and yet she's tempted so to do. She disobeys God, and as a result, we have the fall. As a result, Adam and Eve, suddenly share knowledge, and with that comes shame and guilt, and so on and so forth. She, though, is, if you like, the active agent of the evil that follows. But Eve's defense, surely, is that God set this all up to begin with. So, in that sense, how is she guilty? She's simply doing what she was predestined by God to do. I've got a wonderful image here that I want to show you of Adam and Eve. It's by Peter Paul Rubens. He painted this in 1628. Look at that, isn't that terrific? There she is, taking the forbidden fruit. And you can see the kind of cherub-like visage of that, the evil presence, the devil at the top, and the serpent-like tail that he seems to have. I mean, there's the Apollonian and the Dionysian there, if you like. And so it is that we're about to fall, ladies and gentlemen, because of what Eve has just done. I mean, and the story of Adam and Eve, in terms of the theology, is fascinating. There are so many different versions of it. Stephen Greenblatt has just come out with a fabulous book on this, if you're at all interested, so you should explore that. But ultimately what happened was that the story was the interpretation of the story was taken over by St. Augustine, who's often known as Augustine of Hippo, because of where he eventually ended up in Algiers, in Africa. So we're talking about 430 AD, I think that's when he died. And Augustine interpreted this story as founding original sin. The idea here is called concupiscence. And so it is that for Augustine, lust is intrinsically evil. And even in the case of a husband and wife who marry with the blessings of the church, and after all, the church encourages us to marry and have children and procreate, even that sacred union of husband and wife, when it comes to their consummation of the marriage for the purpose of reproduction, having a child, involves an original sin. What Augustine says is that the only way you can have a child is by having sex, and sex is evil. And so it is that the child is born out of evil, out of an active evil. And this is the stain on us all. And by the way, this of course explains the thinking behind virginity and celibacy. This is why priests in the Christian church, or the Catholic Roman church at least, are required, at least notionally, to be celibate. It's because that means they do not enter that realm of concupiscence, of engaging in sinful acts. They have no lust. Okay, that's the principle. It's fascinating how that interpretation took over other sort of Jovinian or other interpretations, which might have completely changed the history of the Catholic Church. But anyway, that's another story, and it's not for English 100. But it's clearly invited here in this story. And that is, if you like, the predicament of the bride that we're being asked to consider. She's kind of doomed and fated to this role that she's playing. And in that sense, how can she be deemed to be guilty of it? On the other hand, there is self-agency here and an element of free will. Okay? All right. Jean-Yves, the piano tuner. Just a couple of things about him. He's not just a piano tuner, he's blind. And he has a name, unlike all the other characters here. He seems to be that kind of moral pivot point in the story, or that kind of, that foundation, if there is one. He is the moral perspective. So surely the point is that if he is the moral perspective, it's a perspective that does not gaze. He cannot objectify because he doesn't have the eyes to do so, or at least he's blind. And perhaps that's why he plays the role that he does here in the story. Jean-Yves, it's a play on Eve. I imagine we have this kind of sort of bisexual suggestion here in his name, and it's no accident that he's associated with music. I mean, after all, he could have been a blind gardener. He could have been a blind butler, servant. He could have been a blind chauffeur. Well, it couldn't be a blind chauffeur, right? He's a blind piano tuner. Why? This takes us to music and the importance of music in this text. There are so many references to it. The bride is a very accomplished, if not virtuoso, pianist. So a couple of things here. The first is, I think that music arguably is that artistic form beyond objectification. If we think about how we objectify, we do so by looking, gazing, but we also do so in language. And we talked about this, I think, in video 3, right? How the metaphoric process is one of objectification. So music is beyond language, and it's beyond the gaze, and it's that realm of sensation that we can, if you like, enjoy without the risk that comes with objectification. The other thing to note about music here, and it's something I just picked up on reading this yesterday, note what the bride does. The first time they meet, where is this? It's like page. Oh, it doesn't matter. I think it's going to be on page 13. The first time the Marquis encounters the bride, she's playing Debussy, impressionistic music and a reverie, dream. And of course, that's important too in terms of how we approach the story, and I'll come to that a bit later. When she's really under stress and desperate inside this prison, effectively, she plays Bach. She plays all of the well-tempered clavier, these 24 preludes and fugues that Bach writes, an act of genius. And if there was anything suggestive of Apollonian mathematical, logical construction of music, it's going to be Bach. That doesn't mean to say it's not beautifully melodic, it really is. But we've got a contrast between the dreamy, impressionistic reveries of Debussy and the strict formulaic, logical, mathematical music that she turns to in an attempt to rationalize her predicament. So music's playing an important part here, and so does Jean-Yves. The mother, well, she's described right at the start of the story as this kind of heroic figure, isn't she? I mean, I think she killed a tiger or something. She's heroic, she's brave. She's skeptical about what her young daughter, her precocious young daughter, is about to do. And it is her intuition, her maternal sense, which saves the story right at the end. Yeah, there's a reference here to the maternal telepathy that sent my mother running headlong from the telephone to the station after I'd called her that night. I never heard you cry before, she said. Not when you were happy, and who ever cried because of gold bath taps? So, and she is the figure who, manages to jump in at the last moment and retrieve the situation in an almost comic way. We're getting there. Just stay with me for another 10 minutes and we'll be done. If we move on from characterization and plot, we need to consider setting. And that doesn't just mean place, but also time. There is no specific literal mention of either in this story. It's only suggested. So we should ask ourselves why. But what is suggested? We have a suggestion of time. We have reference to telephones and trains. There's something therefore suggestive of early 20th century. And we have a suggestion of place in the description that we are given. I think page 13 is going to help us. Towards the top of 13, sea, sand, a sky that melts into the sea, a landscape of misty pastels, with a look about it of being continuously on the point of melting. Here's the reference to the harmonies of Debussy as kind of an impressionistic scene. Yes, his castle. The fairy solitude of the place, with its turrets of misty blue, courtyard, spiked gate, that lay in the very bosom of the sea, with seabirds mewing about its attics, and the casements opening onto the green and purple. That lovely, sad sea siren of a place, with a causeway. Are you thinking of somewhere? Some of you are, I know, and some of you not. So why don't I take you to exactly the place that I'm pretty sure is being suggested here? Remember that we're told that the Marquis' estate was in Brittany, which is in northern France. And so I think it's this. This is the Mont Saint-Michel, just off the north coast of Brittany. And an abbey was established there back in the 9th century and has been, developed. And during the 100 Years' War, which was the 14th to the 15th century between the French and the English couldn't take it. They tried several times. They just couldn't. They couldn't do it. It's obviously very difficult to take, isn't it? To lay siege to this place, not least because of the bloody water around it. And here is another shot, which I thought was nice. Yeah, because you can see better the causeway there. Great place to go and visit, okay? So put it on the bucket list, along with all those other places. So I think that's the setting we are at least invited to conjure in our minds. But, you know, we need to ask ourselves why we don't have a specific date or place. And I think it's because this is not science fiction. Or let me put it this way. This is deliberately fantasy. So we're talking about genre now, okay? This is fairy tale stroke fantasy. But Carter wants us to take a message about, from the story. She wants to communicate a message. And it's to do about the passing into adulthood, maturation, the pain and suffering of that. I mean, it's to do with all the things we've been talking about, but this is the message she wants to convey. And it is importantly, partly about what men do to women, right? So insofar as she finds it important to convey a message, this story needs to be embedded, to an extent at least. And that's why we do have these references to time and place. So in other words, what I think she's telling us is, yes, this is a fantasy. Yes, this is fairy tale cartoon-like, but only just. It's an exaggeration, but only just. And that's why we have, I think, this gap, but fairly narrow gap between, fantasy and reality here. All right, the last thing I want to turn to is style and language, which is most directly apposite or relevant to what we're doing in English 100, isn't it? Stylistically, how would you describe this text? It is so rich in description, isn't it? In adjectival modifiers, in metaphors, and in similes. It's, you read the story, it's like a very rich chocolate cake. It could almost be too much after a while. You need to sort of read this and then go and read some Ernest Hemingway, which we will do actually down the track. So we might describe it as Baroque in that sense, with 17th century artistic movement, but we can talk about a Baroque style of literature in its ornamentation, in its deliberate flourish, in its deliberate overt sensuality. There's a blend of Gothic here too, of course, you've got that. So stylistically, I think that's what we've got in front of us. It's a very Vatic style of writing. And if we turn to the language itself, it will help, I think, just to go to the first paragraph. We have a first-person narrator. That does many things in a literary text. What it does, more than anything else, is that it traps us, whether we like it or not, inside the mind of the narrator. There is no external kind of overview or position of judgment. We're inside. That often means we don't know whether to entirely trust what we're being told. And here, there's very much a sense of reverie and dream. I mean, we've had references to it throughout the story. But look at how this begins. I remember how, and so she's in a state of trying to sleep or in and out of sleep here. But then the next paragraph, and I remember I imagined how. So it's as though now we're at one remove of what she was actually thinking or imagining at the time. So right from the start, just in terms of the language that's being used, we're being encouraged to think of this as delirium, as a type of dream nightmare. And this is another way in which we can perhaps understand how Carter is communicating the theme here. It's through this kind of feverish, nightmarish imagination of this child, of this young girl. Look at the syntax. Look at this long compound sentence here in the first paragraph, which in its rhythms almost suggests a train going over the tracks. You know, so my burning cheek pressed against the impeccable linen of the pillow, and the pounding of my heart mimicking that of the great pistons ceaselessly thrusting the train that bore me through the night, away from Paris, away from girlhood, away from the white enclosed quietude of my mother's apartment, into the unguessable country of marriage. There's the journey. All of it in that one paragraph. In fact, everything is there in that one paragraph. You know, the images of light and dark, of burning fire, burning blood against the impeccable linen, one assumes white or cream, of the pillow. The pounding of her heart like pistons, which suggests this passion inside her, this unruly Dionysian kind of elemental force inside her, which is erotic. She can't sleep. She's so excited, and she's being taken through the night away. We have a literal journey here too. Metaphors, similes abound. Of course they do, right? You know why now. This is about objectification. And so of course you're going to be liberally spreading around the metaphors. And to take you there, 15, I think. I mean, look, we could go anywhere, couldn't we? But I think this is just underlining what we're saying here. So here we are, Gourmand stripping her as if he was stripping the leaves off an artichoke. A child with stick-like limbs, it's metaphoric. There she is, bare as a lamb chop. Something purchased. What have we got here at the end? Finalizing our theme, I think we have a journey of maturation. This is a story about a girl becoming a woman, with all that entails. The passion of it, the excitement of it, the fear of it, the brutality of it. And in a way, it has a happy ending, doesn't it? You know, she's there with the blind piano tuner, the mother. She describes the piano tuner as her lover. There's even a suggestion of future motherhood, perhaps, and that union with him. It has a happy ending, but it also has an ending that carries within it the shame that's inside us. Look at how the story ends. No paint, nor powder, no matter how thick or white, can mask that red mark on my forehead. I'm glad he cannot see it. Not for fear of his revulsion, since I know he sees me clearly with his heart, but because it spares my shame. Fabulous, yeah? I think so anyway. If you are already thinking of a film, or perhaps a piece of music, a painting, or another story, or another novel, or something, then there's your presentation. It's already there. All you need to do is take me to that, whatever it is, and tell me how and in what way you think it reminds you of the themes that we've been discussing today. Sorry, that I've been telling you about today in this video. Are there similarities in characterization, in the journeys taken, in the symbolism that's used, in the style? Tell me about that. Come up with something, and I'll be very interested to see what you've got. All right, now we will move on to Edgar Allan Poe for the next video, and maybe a couple of things too. Much shorter stories. And if this really didn't work for you, this story, and for some students it really doesn't, then hopefully what we turn to in the next video will. Okay, thank you for your time, and I'll see you.